Welcome to Sources. I'm your host, Svetlana Marshall. Tonight, we'll be talking about Guyana's general and regional election set to take place tomorrow. To do so with me, I have the Public Relations Officer of the Guyana Elections Commission, Ms. Yolanda Ward. Ms. Ward, welcome to Sources.
Thank you so much for having me, Svetlana. It's a privilege to be here.
Are you excited that we're almost there?
Very, very excited. We have been on the operational role since maybe April. And so, of course, I know for the ops team in particular, we're tired, but at the same time, we're very happy that we're at a comfortable place to efficiently deliver the conduct of the polls tomorrow.
Now, President Finale, on the eve of Guyana's independence celebration this year, announced that elections would be held on September 1. Now, help me understand, once that declaration or the date is set, what really transpires at the Secretariat end to ensure that we get to this point?
So, very important, Svetlana. I think you accurately put it into perspective there in terms of the president making that proclamation, because we have a lot of persons who are under the perception that it's GCOM who does the setting of that date and all of that. That authority is not invested in GCOM. It's the president who by proclamation declares a date for general and regional elections. For us at GCOM, even prior to that proclamation, our work began, because we're cognizant that constitutionally, general and regional elections were due this year. And so putting our operations machinery into focus, we started work very early in the year. So while our work plan could not have taken into consideration statutory timelines, we were able to put some non-statutory activities into motion. For example, we commenced training very early in April. We started some small civic and voter education activities until we get to the ramp-up phase. We started looking in terms of our procurement needs, especially for the non-sensitive items. And so our work was in motion even prior to that proclamation. But with that proclamation, brought the legal bearings into our work plan into perspective.
Tell me a bit about the work plan and some of the legal guidelines that ought to be followed in order to ensure that the election is held within keeping the laws of the country.
Right. So once there is a proclamation, we now have a date. And so in the development of our work plan, essentially it's important for us to work backwards, because within the framing of the legal language, it speaks to the time by which certain things must happen, no later than 21 days before election day, no later than 10 days, no later than 7 days. And so we had to take all those sections into perspective, and hence my mention of statutory timelines. I want to particularly note that the conduct of elections in general is guided by a legal framework. While GCOM and its secretariat operationalize within the framework of the law, we have to be guided by those respective sections. So with a date, we were able to work backwards to ensure that we achieve all the statutory timelines that the law expects us to achieve within the specific time. And so we set those timelines within that work plan. So the work plan is ideally a combination of the legal subset as well as the operational subset or the administrative subset to ensure that this project we call general and regional elections is delivered within the framework of the law.
Okay, and so one of the key timelines would have to be for the setting of nominations.
That's correct.
And claims and objection.
Right. Well, not necessarily claims and objections as a statutory period, but of course the law speaks to nomination day as a statutory timeline, no later than 32 days before election day. For example, we have proxy. The law says no later than 21 days before election day, an application must be submitted. So these are key timelines that we have to ensure that we stick within that framework. So nomination day, as you know, was on the 14th of July. It is that statutory timeline that we consider to be one of the very, very critical timeline, because that is the midway point as to when list of candidates are submitted for approval for contesting in that election. And of course, those list of candidates must meet certain legal criteria. And I think we would have gone through that in terms of those legal criteria and all of that. So we've gone past that mark. We know now we have 6 political parties that are in the race contesting these elections.
A total of 7 had submitted.
Right.
1 did not meet the requirements.
That's correct. So you have to ensure that, first of all, that they meet those criteria that is required by law. And I keep emphasizing law because a lot of times in the conduct of elections, people tend to think that, you know, these are systems that GCOM is just coming up with and putting into place. But there is a legal framework that we follow, and we have to be guided by that legal framework.
I know you said that the claims and objection period does not necessarily fall within the statutory guideline, but I want to talk about that, how GCOM would arrive at the dates for claims and objection, and how important it is in the compilation of the list, because I want to, you know, set some time to deal with that list.
Right. So, Svetlana, first of all, the electoral process does not start when a proclamation is made for a date of elections. The electoral process starts from national registration. So the Constitution has invested GCOM specifically with 2 mandates. One, the conduct of national registration, which is guided by the National Registration Act, and of course, the conduct of local government elections and general and regional elections. So that electoral process starts from the time of national registration. The law prescribes certain criteria by which we must abide by for a person to be registered. First of all, attaining the age of 14 years and older. We find a lot of people, because they know that the legal age for voting is 18, but registration actually starts from the age of 14 years old. So that electoral process in our lives as citizens starts from the time we're 14. When we apply for registration, you're eligible as a Guyanese by birth, descent, naturalization, or a citizen of a Commonwealth country living in Guyana for 1 year or more. So when you're registered, you're entered into the National Register of Registrants database. So you don't automatically go into a list. So you fall into that database. At the time now of a claims and objections period, because the extracting or getting to OLE starts with claims and objections. So as you know, we have continuous registration. But to get to that claims and objections, we have to start from a base. That base is a preliminary list of electors.
And that is extracted from the national database.
So that PLE, as we call it for short, is extracted from that National Register of Registrants database. A qualifying date is set. In this case, the qualifying date set is June 30, 2025. So when that PLE was extracted then, it gives those eligible persons who would have been 18 years and older by the 30th of June, who never applied for registration, to ensure that they register. So ensuring the inclusivity, equal access, ensuring everybody gets that opportunity to participate in this democratic process that is coming up, that is called elections. So you have that opportunity to ensure that I make a claim to entry now into that list.
Can you get to vote if you don't register?
No, not at all. So one of the prerequisites to voting is that you must be included in that official list of electors.
And in this case, you have to be 18 by July 30th.
By the 30th of June.
Oh, June.
So we have that issue too, where somebody says, look, I'm 18, I'm an adult, I'm registered. I turn 18 on the 1st of July. The qualifying date is the 30th of June. So these are things that we have to be cognizant of in terms of that qualifying period. So when we extract a PLE, it's not just about a person making a claim to register because they've not been registered, but it's affording persons who've already been registered the opportunity to apply for transfer, do changes to their names, or if they're applying for a correction in relation to the spelling of their name. When we move from there, we get a revised list of electors. You now want to see that those persons who registered during that claims, that it's reflected there, those changes that you apply for in relation to your transfer and all of that, name changes and all of that, it is reflected
But
there.
before we get to the revised list of electors, I want you to address the objection, claims and objection, the objection element
Right.
of it all.
Right.
So persons, is it that I'm objecting to my address? Could I say that?
Right. So the objections.
Or you object to
aspect.
somebody on the list that should not
Right.
be there?
So you can object to the inclusion of the names of persons whom you suspect. Note I'm saying suspect may not be eligible for inclusion on the list.
Okay.
For example, the margin of error for this is almost zero because our team ensures that they place specific emphasis on those extractions. For example, and on the age person appearing on that list. That is something that people can make an objection to. But I'm saying that the margin for that is practically almost zero. Secondly, we have the case of objecting to persons who may have been deceased. The issue there is that the burden of proof is on the person making the objection to provide that proof. This is not something that GCOM wants to put as a barrier that we say this can't happen. But this is the legal framework that we have to operate within the confines by. There are even additional rulings in the court on these matters in terms of the procedures used to remove persons from the list. So making an objection, you have to ensure that you provide that burden of proof to move that objection. And of course, once that we've done the investigation, that objection is upheld and we remove persons from the list.
Now, oftentimes we hear about a bloated list, right? And sometimes the opposition, they believe that not enough is being done to sanitize the list in a sense. And I know that now we're at the stage of the official list of electors. I want you to help me understand, how does GCOM go about sanitizing the list, if it's okay for me to use that term?
Svetlana, as I've always been emphasizing, our work falls within a legal parameter. And we can only operate within the confines of what the law provides for. We have a process that is in force, that has always been in force, where we receive debt return from the General Register's office, and with those returns, we are constantly flagging deceased from within our database.
So you're constantly doing that?
Constantly doing that. Those reports from GRA submitted to us showing monthly debt returns, I can safely say the number fluctuates. Sometimes you might have 2,000 in a quarter or even more. So the numbers fluctuate, but it's a process that GCOM is constantly engaged in because it is within our legal scope to use that return to do so. And we have been doing that.
Now, the integrity of the list is important. And although we're at the stage of the official list of electors, you still have complaints that, oh, I'm seeing a dead person on the list, the name of a dead person. What may be responsible for that?
Svetlana, there are many issues. For example, somebody may not have been, the debt has not been registered, so GRO may not be able to send that to us. A relative may not have presented, or somebody, the requisite documentation for us to do that removal. But you would notice that recently, because this has been a concern, we have published the safeguards that are in place, particularly when it comes to the integrity of the conduct of the poll, to ensure that we do not have a case of impersonation, to ensure that the voter who presents themselves to the poll to vote is the person who will be casting their ballot. And there are safeguards in place for that. So while there is this concern, we are also cognizant too that with the amendment to the National Registration Act, that there is a process of continuous registration. Now we have more than ever before, we have a case of registration being done on a 5-month stretch, and that is followed by claims and objections. So the opportunity for more persons to register on a more frequent basis between 2022 is present there.
And since you mentioned that, because I was going to compare the list, the official list in 2020, when it was just about 600,000 plus persons listed to vote, and now we're at a point where it's 700,000 plus people listed to vote.
Right. So as I said, continuous registration is happening all the time. People are becoming of age. People are becoming eligible. And therefore, for us, GCOM, as I've been emphasizing, the legal framework provides us with that opportunity to register persons once they have met the eligibility criteria and they've presented the requisite source documents to us.
Okay. And so once the list is finalized, you have what GCOM does next with regards to the electoral process. Is it a case that they decide now that we know it's 750,000 plus people heading to the polls, do you go and set up, well, you define the polling stations,
right.
the geographical areas, things like that?
So our logistics team, well, I should say the operations team as a whole, because they work hand in glove with each other. Using that list now, it is important for us to place electors to polling stations as close as possible within their respective divisions or subdivisions. I want to particularly note that because the law with that amendment says that a polling station should not have more than 400 electors.
Why was that important, though?
I guess for the efficiency in terms of the conduct of the polls. But so we now have 400 persons. So you now have to break that official list of electors into parts to ensure that you are accurately placing people within their division as close as possible to where they reside, and ensuring that we are in conformity with what the law prescribes, that we should not have more than 400 electors at a polling station.
So now you have more than 2,700 plus polling stations.
That's correct. That's correct.
What other systems ought to be put in place before tomorrow?
Well, as it is right now, we are comfortable and ready and all set for the opening of our 2,790 polling stations across the country. As I've mentioned, we have started our training.
Yeah, and I was going to get to that.
Way ahead of time.
With regards.
Right. So we have trained more than 16,000 persons. 16,000 persons across the country to get them ready. Out of that 16, because of course we operate with an evaluation and all of that, we have been able to employ more than 13,000 of those persons. So from presiding officers to assistant presiding officers to poll clerks, the information clerk, we have been able to successfully satisfy that requirement for the efficient conduct of the polls tomorrow.
Okay, so they're well trained.
Well trained. In fact, Svetlana, it's not just a one round of training. We've had a case where we've been back. We've actually been able to do refresher training. These persons who are assigned to polling stations have been over the past 2 weeks in their groups under the supervisions of the DROs conducting mock polls to ensure that they understand all those procedures, that they are clear in terms of what they're required to do, and that so tomorrow morning when the polls open at 6, we can see the smooth and efficient and professional conduct of polling day officials, that electors are comfortable in casting their ballots.
So I want to get to what happens during the voting process. You said polls open at 6 a.m.
Right.
and I know it closes at 6 p.m. Now walk me through the process. I'm a first-time voter. I get to the polling station. Do I check? I check for my name. Well, I have to check for my name to know where I'm voting.
Well, I would hope that by now everyone knows where they're voting tomorrow, because we have made it so easy that we have a query tool online. Previously, people were going to the polling station to check the list. Now, simple, they can go to our website. And if they've not done so yet, I want to urge persons to go to GCOM's website to do that, to ensure that they know where they're voting. And so when you turn up at the polling station, of course, there is a physical list there, and you want to be sure, go right ahead. It's going to be there, but you can check the website and know exactly where you're going tomorrow morning, because you don't want to see a situation where you're turning up to polling station A and then you're not voting there. You have to go somewhere where, to avoid all doubts and confusion, know where you're going to vote ahead of time. So if you've not done so yet, this is the opportunity to go to the website and get that done.
I want you to know that I've done so. I've checked.
Right, and that's commendable. So you arrive at the polling station. I would hope that everyone is getting out early to do that, and therefore they may expect a queue. But we do not anticipate that people will be there for long hours because, as I mentioned, we are very confident in the efficiency of the staff that will be manning those polls tomorrow. So legally, it's not just that the poll opens at 6. Legally, the polls are required to be open at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. So the first elector enters at 6 at each polling station to cast his or her ballot tomorrow. So you arrive at the polling station. The poll clerk at 6, the presiding officer at 6 a.m. will declare the poll open and invite the first elector in. That elector comes in, presents an ID card, a passport, a driver's license to the poll clerk, and even in the absence of any of those documents, they are still allowed to vote. Of course, the process takes a slightly different turn. But let's deal with an elector with a form of identification. Presents that to the poll clerk. The poll clerk checks the list to ensure that that elector is listed there. And then they call the serial number that the person is listed at on the list and the particulars, displays the ID for, of course, as you know, at the polling station, there the presence of agents from political parties to check for them to see clearly that the person standing before them is the person who the person claimed to be. But in addition to that, as part of our safeguard mechanism, there is a folio with the photo ID, and I want to emphasize in colored, present at all of these polling stations, where agents will have a copy, presiding officer will have a copy, poll clerk has a copy, and they're able to check to ensure that that ID card before them matches what they have on the folio, matches the identity of the person that is standing before them. Once that they've gone through that process, that person is directed to the presiding officer, who will then check the person's fingers for stains, because of course, as you know, indelible ink. They've gone through that process. They then go through some small administrative details in terms of detaching the ballot from the counterfoil and all these kind of things. And so they're then asked whether they know to vote. And even if that elector has voted before, it is the responsibility of that presiding officer to ensure that they still offer that elector directions for voting. So they will show them that it's 2 parts of the ballot.
You're voting in the general.
The top is for general, the bottom is for regional. And so in terms of folding the ballot after they've completed voting, those directions will be given to each elector. So it is important that before that presiding officer issues that ballot to that elector, it must be stamped with the official 6-digit number of that polling station at the top and the bottom halves. It is the responsibility of the presiding officer, but equally it's the responsibility of the elector to ensure that when they're given a ballot, that ballot is stamped at the top and at the bottom. I want to emphasize that a ballot without a stamp is not a valid ballot, and therefore that ballot will not be counted.
Now,
So,
if the top is stamped and the bottom is not stamped,
right.
what happens next?
There is a methodology in place for that, because of course the intent is there that that ballot was indeed stamped at that polling station.
Okay.
So at the time of the count, if that is discovered, then certainly the presiding officer will indicate in the presence of agents that this is stamped at the top, and therefore they now place that stamp at the bottom because of course the intent was there. But without any stamp, that ballot is an invalid ballot. So it is important too that as electors approach the presiding officers to receive their ballot, we do not anticipate that the presiding officer will not stamp a ballot, but electors too can be aware that their ballot is supposed to be stamped, and so ensure that the ballot is stamped before they receive that ballot.
Now, what happens if I show up, I don't have an ID, driver's license, or a passport? I know persons get to vote still, but walk me through the process. How do you ensure that the person who is appearing before the presiding officer is the person indeed? With the, matches the identity.
The person comes, presents says their name, says I don't have an ID card. That poll clerk immediately directs that person to the presiding officer. The presiding officer then will bring it to the attention of all in the polling station that this is an elector.
When you say all in the polling station, you're referring to the parties, agents, observers.
Right, so that this person is here to vote. They do not have an ID card. Then they will say what the name is. It matches serial number, whatever serial number on the list. In that case now, they will then, the agents will have the opportunity, the presiding officer, to look on the folio to see whether the person standing in front of them matches that photograph on that folio. They will also be questioned. There's some questions that will be asked of them that will be on that folio that only that person is supposed to know the answers to those questions. And so once the presiding officer is satisfied that that person who is standing before him or her is the person who they claim to be, they will be administered an oath of identity before they're allowed to vote. So while it may sound very long and complicated, these are all mechanisms in place, safeguards, to ensure that everyone who is eligible is given that opportunity to vote, and it's not complicated. The voting process, as we like to say it, it's easy as 1, 2, 3. You show up, you're eligible, your name is on the list. Of course, the staff will help you and guide you through that process to ensure that your ballot is cast.
Now, the joint services, members of the discipline forces, let me use the correct term, members of the discipline forces went to the polls on Friday, August 22. How do you detect that a person, a member of the discipline forces, would have voted before if they show up at the polling station tomorrow?
Right. So what we've done from the time those lists came back, we've gone through a process of a strike-off. So the name stays right there, but there is a line drawn through that name, which is an indication that that person has already voted. So that person will not be allowed to vote because that line indicates that they've already voted. So we have that methodology in place. It's no different. It's what obtains all the time in all elections.
I know almost 10,500 were listed to vote, members of the discipline forces. About 83% of them voted on August 22nd. Now, if the remaining percentage shows up at the poll, would they get an opportunity to vote?
Right, correct. So their names will be on the list at the respective polling station where they are registered to vote. So they will be able to go there and cast their ballot.
The other question has to do with proxy. I know that GCOM received just over 3,000 plus applications for proxy. I'm assuming by now those applications have either been approved or disapproved based on investigations done by the, is it the returning officers or the presiding officer?
The returning officers.
Okay, great. Now, if I show up with a proxy form or certificate.
Right. So there's actually an appointment that you will be issued. So that proxy must be voting at the same time when they're voting for themselves.
Okay.
So you don't go and you come again. If you know that you have been appointed to vote by proxy for someone, you ensure you take along that appointment with you. So when you are going to cast your ballot, so that you vote for yourself and you vote for that person.
How
at
many
the same
persons
time.
could I vote for if I have an approved?
At least two persons you're given that opportunity. Two persons, no more than two persons.
Does the commission or the secretariat have authority? Because if I'm voting for somebody, I guess they have to trust me first to allow me to vote for them. But if they want me to vote for a specific party, is there any mechanism to ensure that?
We
No?
don't. But of course, that person will be also be on the oath to ensure that they are carrying out the wishes of those persons.
The other thing is certificate of employment.
Right.
The certificate of employment, is it issued only to GCOM staff, and would they be permitted to vote where they're working? How does that work?
Right. So I want to note that particularly for this election, the use of certificate of employment will not be in effect because what we've on a wide scale, because what we've tried to do is to ensure that the persons who are working, particularly for GCOM, are placed at polling stations that are close as practicable to where they are required to vote.
Okay.
So that issue of certificate of employment does not bring much of a focus into what we can expect tomorrow. But it's not only for persons who are employed by GCOM. The law also provides for certificate of employment to be used for persons who are connected with the election, such as candidates to the poll, and they will be performing duties away from where they are scheduled to vote. So those persons, but of course with certificate of employment, you cannot be performing duties in Region 3 and you're supposed to be voting in Region 4. You have to be voting within the district that you're registered to vote. It may be at a different polling station, but remember the ballots are region specific too. So you have to be able to vote within the region where you are registered to vote.
Okay. So you're saying people do not get to, I'm trying to understand the issue with regards to the certificate of employment. You're saying, say for example, I'm originally from Region 10, Linden. If I'm working with GCOM,
Right.
and I'm working in Georgetown, how does that work?
So in that case, there is a methodology in place. That person may have had to probably use a proxy.
Okay.
To get that done, to vote in District 10 where they actually reside to vote. A certificate of employment will not qualify for that.
A question often put, or people reach out to journalists and they ask, what happened to those working offshore, the offshore workers, whether any special provision would be put in place for them to vote.
Right. Svetlana, that's a big one that has confronted us in this election because, of course, we're an emerging oil economy. Again, as I've been saying throughout this interview and as I've always been saying, the conduct of GCOM has to stay within the legal parameters. And the law does not give GCOM that authority to so facilitate offshore workers. Proxy, the law speaks to who are the persons eligible to apply for proxy. It speaks to persons who are physically incapacitated, persons who are blind, persons connected with assignments as it relates to the election. It speaks specifically to members of the Transport and Harbors Department who will be operating a vessel on election day. So not just a broad category of members of the Transport and Harbors Department, but they must show proof when we do that investigation that they will be operating a vessel on election day. This is something new. I'm sure that maybe futuristically the framers of our legislation will have to go back and maybe possibly consider amendments and all of that. But as it is now, we have to stay within the confines of what the law provides for.
But the law provides for persons, employers, to ensure that employees are given the opportunity
correct.
to vote.
Section 81 of the Representation of the People Act speaks specifically to employers giving their employees time off to vote. And this is across the board. It's not just about offshore workers.
Okay.
So it's across the board. The law speaks to the penalties involved there. And therefore, we're expecting that employees be compliant with what those legal provisions are.
Now, I know we shift a bit, but I want to go back to the whole voting process and what happens during voting. Now, an issue that came up, and it's a concern for political parties, both the government, I see, and the opposition, some opposition parties talking about it, is the secrecy of the ballot. They're concerned that there may be cases of vote selling or buying, however you want to coin it. What is being done? I know GCOM has put some measures in place to ensure that that whoever you're voting for, that it remains a secret.
Right. Svetlana, in fact, the Commission has discussed this matter at length. And they've came up with a methodology to ensure that this is adequately addressed. In fact, compromising the secrecy of the ballot is an election offense. So persons must first of all understand that it is an offense to compromise the secrecy of your ballot. For example, if somebody votes and they walk out of that voting compartment and they come and they display that ballot in the polling station who they voted for, that ballot is not allowed to be dropped into that ballot box. It is now a destroyed ballot.
Okay.
That is how serious the secrecy of the ballot is.
Would they get to vote back at least?
So I'm sure if the presiding officer may have to have sufficient reason why that is allowed, if that's allowed.
Okay.
But the thing about it is that the systems are there. People need to understand the importance of the process. And it's that they're right, and they ought to protect their rights to the secrecy of the ballot. And therefore, in so doing, we would hope that the safeguards that the Commission has put in place stay in force as we go through the conduct of the polls tomorrow.
What are those safeguards? When I get to the polls, what must I expect? What would I be told?
So, as you've noticed, we've particularly issued a notice in relation to the prohibition of phones or recording devices as a whole. And so persons, there will be signs there at the polling station. Persons will be encouraged to turn off their phones. The presiding officer will continuously make announcement to the queue, asking persons to ensure that they turn off their phones before they enter the polling station. The positioning of the voting compartment is one that the Commission has also examined. We've also taken the initiative to place a desk at the side of that voting compartment to ask persons to lodge or to just rest their phones or whatever bag they may have there to ensure that they free themselves as they go into the voting compartment. The important thing is that as electors, we have to understand that we have certain rights and we have certain responsibilities. Those rights and responsibilities must be taken into consideration within the framework of the law. And the secrecy of your ballot is one of those responsibilities that you have. In fact, it's a right for you to cast your ballot for whichever party you seem so fit. And therefore, there will be no reason for you to want to compromise that secrecy of your ballot.
No, I know during the voting by members of the discipline services, after they went to the polls, we saw at least 2 cases where persons exhibited the ballots and, show who they voted for.
Right.
What has been done since then to strengthen those measures that GCOM said, it's fitting?
Well, in relation to the strengthening, one of the key measures that the Commission has re-examined is in terms of the positioning of that voting compartment. And so we would hope that adherence prevail tomorrow and that persons avoid committing election offenses and that they get out there early, cast their ballot in an orderly manner. Our staff, I'm happy to say that we have a professional cadre of persons who will be manning those polls. And therefore, I do not anticipate any hiccups that can prevent anything from happening at that poll tomorrow.
Before we get to the close of poll, oftentimes, and in 2020 we heard this a lot, and throughout from 2020 to now, the opposition in particular have been concerned about fraudulent voting and things like that. Just help me understand, what are the safeguards in place to ensure that the voting process, the integrity of the process is maintained, and that minimize, if not eradicate, any possibility of...
Svetlana, you've seen it on by way of social media. We've been publishing in the newspaper those multiple safeguards that we have in place. Number one, the presence of political party agents who are there observing and scrutinizing that process. The identification of the elector, the presence of indelible ink. We have observers. In this election, we have accredited over 600 observers that will be out there observing these elections across the country. So these are all safeguards that are in place to ensure that the integrity remains intact. I want to particularly mention that with the amendment to the Representation of the People's Act, speaks specifically to the penalties and fines for persons who attempt to breach any of those procedures, including GCOM staff. And so therefore, I believe that I do not anticipate any of that coming into focus during these elections. It is of paramount importance that we place a specific emphasis on that because, and hence I've been emphasizing the professional conduct of our staff at those respective polling stations. But there are safeguards in place, and we will ensure that those safeguards are adhered to.
Now, it's 6 p.m. in the afternoon, Monday, September 1.
Right.
You have a long line, but the poll
Right.
closes at 6. Do you
Right.
take those in, or do you say, well, next 5 years?
Well, we have to. By law, we have to. So, while voting says 6 to 6, or the law says, oh, this happens 6 to 6, the reality is that every polling station does not close at 6 p.m. So, a polling station might close at 6 p.m., while another close at 9 p.m. In their poll book, the close of poll time will vary across the board. And that is dependent on the number of electors that are in that line at 6 p.m. So the methodology in place for that is that the presiding officer at 6 p.m. will count the number of persons in that line, and they will ask the police officer to stand behind the last person, which means that nobody is supposed to be able to join that line, whether at the back or in the middle, because first of all, the presiding officer has a count as to the number of electors that we will now be processing from 6 p.m. That's one. Two, that police officer will not be able to allow anybody to join that line, whether behind him or her, or to allow any person to come into the middle of that line. So whenever that process wraps up and all those electors in the queue have been given the opportunity to vote, then is when at that polling station that the poll is declared closed.
Okay, so the poll is declared closed. Everybody from the queue now gone.
Right.
It's time to count the ballots.
Right.
The agents, I assume, are still there.
Right.
Observers
Of course.
probably visiting.
Of course.
Right? Now, there's the issue of one, what's the difference between a rejected ballot, a spoiled ballot, and a destroyed ballot before we get to the counting?
Right.
Because I suspect that when you're counting, you have to take account for all the ballots used.
Right. Right. So, first of all, there is a methodology in place as to what happens at the count, where in the presence of the agents, the ballot box will be then open. The ballots will first of all be detached, in that you will now separate general from regional. Of course, looking carefully to ensure that the official mark in the form of that 6-digit number is on that ballot. In relation to spoiled ballots will not be in that ballot box because you can detect from before, and there's a special envelope that spoiled ballot goes into. For example, a spoiled ballot constitutes the presence of ink. The ballot clerk will be directing that elector how to hold that ballot, how to drop that ballot, because there's required now to ink their finger first before the ballot is dropped. But sometimes that person might quickly go now and hold that ballot with their hand with that ink. So the ink gets on that, but that's a spoiled ballot. So that ballot is taken from that person, destroyed, placed there, and then they're given an opportunity again to have another ballot to ensure that they vote. So you wouldn't find spoiled ballots there. And of course, we spoke earlier in terms of destroyed ballots, the condition under which destroyed ballots. Valid ballots and all of that will be detected. First of all, a first sign is without the official mark. We spoke about that earlier in terms of if we recognize the stamp on one part, what happens with the other part. The other thing has to do is in relation, they question ballots as well, where it's difficult to determine whom the person has voted for, but a question ballot is a valid ballot. And therefore, the presiding officer, they will go through thoroughly and interrogate that process, of course, using the prescribed guidelines to determine how they treat with that ballot. And so with those prerequisites in place, it's not just the case where they are using human judgment. There are clear guidelines in place as to how they go about in relation to that. And so from that preliminary process, that is where the counting starts. And first they count for general, and then they count for regional. Of course, in the presence of the agents there, ensuring that it is done in a way that is satisfactory to all the persons who've observed the conduct of the poll throughout the day.
So once the statement of poll has been generated or it filled out, it's posted.
Right. So, of course, given everybody who've witnessed that come the opportunity, agents there, to sign that statement of poll. So then it's posted. They've placed the requisite amount of statement of polls into respective envelopes for transition to the RO, the CEO, the chairman. So they're packages that they have to deliver to those respective offices.
Now, for the first time in Guyana's history, 3 regions have been subdivided.
Right.
So you have sub-districts.
Right.
And so those sub-districts would be headed, in a sense, and those divisions would be headed by supernumerary officers. Returning officers. The transport of the SOPs, because some people might say, you know.
Right. So what we actually have happening, we have deputy returning officers who will be responsible for clusters of polling stations. So what will happen is that each DRO will then be coordinating to uplift packages from the respective statements of from the respective polling stations with the presence of agents and all the sensitive materials, and then to transport to the returning officer or the deputy or the supernumerary returning officer. So because at the office of the supernumerary returning officer, that is where we have a tabulation that will happen.
At the office of the supernumerary officer
so
as well?
where there are sub-districts, where there are sub-districts. So in the case of Region 4, for example, you will have the North Georgetown supernumerary returning officer bringing all those polls, those statements of poll together, and they will have a tabulation exercise at that office. And then when all the 4 districts are combined, then they will transport that to the returning officer, who will then go through that process of the ascertainment of the votes for the entire district.
Now, in 2020, there was much chaos and confusion, especially as it relates to the tabulation of votes, or SOPs, the numbers, however it's coined, for District 4. I know the laws have been amended and systems, I assume, have been strengthened to ensure that, 1, the tabulation process flows smoothly, but 2, that political parties have an opportunity to view what is being exhibited.
Right.
What exactly are those systems when it comes to the tabulation of the votes, whether it's at a sub-district or at the regional level, say, for example, Region 10, where there's no sub-district?
Right. So, as you rightly said, the law has made provisions for how, and clearly directed how that ascertainment must be done. And so there are procedures there that must be followed. And so what is going to happen is that there are screens that we've put in place that will be mounted side by side, where each SOP will be scanned uploaded to that screen so that everyone in that tabulation center can see, and then there is someone who will be entering the data from that SOP on the spreadsheet at a side-by-side screen so that everyone is seeing clearly what is being displayed, what is running. But even before we get to that point, the law specifically states now that GCOM is required to immediately, upon
Upload.
receipt of those SOPs, to ensure that it is uploaded to GCOM's website. So even before that ascertainment and tabulation starts, you will have the opportunity to see those SOPs being uploaded to GCOM's website. I am happy to say that we have developed all the necessary software to ensure that this is a smooth process, that it has been tested, and we do not anticipate any hiccups in relation to those processes. We have tested, and I'm very confident that those processes will not fail us. So all those systems have been tested, the staff has been trained, and so tomorrow at the close of poll, we anticipate that a smooth flow will happen during that exercise.
So once the SOPs get to the returning officer or the supernumerary officers,
Right.
they begin uploading and
Right,
tabulating.
right. So the upload will happen, and then they begin that process in terms of the ascertainment of the results.
One important thing I forgot to ask during the counting process is the issue of intermixing the
Right.
ballots for the discipline services. If we could go back to that before we
Right.
move along the way.
So we've gazetted the polling stations where intermixing will happen. And so those ballots will arrive at those polling stations very early. Of course, I won't get into all the technicalities there in terms of what the presiding officers will be required to do. But importantly, one of the key things, as they unpackage those ballots, they will then be required to stamp those ballots with a 6-digit number that for that respective polling station, and then those are placed into the ballot box at that polling station. So those ballots will be counted at those polling stations that have been gazetted for that purpose.
Going back to the tabulation process, say for sub-district North Georgetown, who would be allowed in the tabulation center
Right.
to observe what is being done and to ensure that, you know, what is
A
expected?
very, very important question, Svetlana, because as the public relations officer, I remember many times being confronted with the media even questioning why is it that we cannot be allowed in. Again, Svetlana, from the beginning of this interview, and as I've always been saying, that we have to be guided by the legal parameters. The law speaks to persons who are eligible to be at a tabulation center. And so only those persons will be allowed to be there within that framework. And of course, there are timelines by which those persons who are designated to be there, the agents and so on, that they had to have received the necessary accreditation, they had to have written to ensure that that is done. And so only those persons that the law provides for in terms of candidates to the poll, well, the prescribed agents to the count and all of that, that will be allowed.
Observers?
And observers will be allowed to witness that process. Anybody outside that who is not under the remit of the legal classification will not be allowed to be part of that exercise.
If there's an objection to the numbers seen, it's not, you're comparing the SOP that I have and the one being projected on the screen.
Right.
It doesn't
well,
correspond.
they've already developed a methodology for that to treat him with objections. The policy is that the returning officer, supernumerary returning officer, will not move on until they are clear and they're able to sort that particular objection. I do not anticipate or foresee that happening with the transparency that is in place for this procedure, but the methodology is if there is an objection until it is rectified, then is when they move on to the other.
Okay. And so once that process concludes, the returning officer, I assume, now files a report or first declare the results of the regional, let me say the electoral district, the results of the electoral district or the geographic constituency. And does what next?
Right. So once that declaration has happened, I want to also not exclude the legal provisions for requests for recount.
Okay.
Right.
I really thought recount comes
right.
after, no?
No, so a recount, once a declaration happens at the district level,
Okay.
then the required person or the designated counting agent for a political party can request a limited count, which a limited count might mean for specific boxes, or they might request a full recount. But of course, they must provide sufficient reasons as to the reasons why they are requesting these recount. And so there are timelines by which this must be done. And therefore, once I think the returning office is satisfied that it's reasonable grounds, then of course that stakeholder is granted that request. So while we have to cater for those other factors there as well once it is done within the prescribed time frame.
You said once the returning officer is satisfied.
Right, because you must provide sufficient grounds upon which you make this request. Right, because you just can't say, oh, I just want a general count because I feel I want a general count. There must be sufficient evidence or sufficient reason as to why you're making this request. And so based upon the reasons you provided, the returning officer for the respective district is invested with that authority to determine whether that's sufficient grounds upon which it can be granted.
I want to ask about the process of identifying returning officers to ensure that they're fair and that, say, for example, given what transpired in 2020, people have all sorts of questions.
So how right away there, let me take you there. We've gone through, as I said, a rigorous training process. The training was not only limited to external people, but even within GCOM, persons who needed that opportunity to participate in that process, it was free for anybody to apply. And from that rigorous process, as I've mentioned, evaluations were involved there. And after that evaluation and scrutiny, it's not about GCOM, it went to the commission.
Okay.
For them to further deliberate on that and make those decisions before they arrive at that appointment. So it's not just that you pluck people out the air, but of course you have to ensure that you find persons that are competent and are able to deliver within the scope that is required of them.
So now that applications for recount are submitted, the tabulation process, of course, has concluded. The report is now with the chief elections officer.
Right, so for all 10 districts.
For all 10 districts.
Right.
He would now
have to prepare a report for submission to the chairman. And it's the basis upon which that report is done that a declaration is made.
Who wins the presidency?
Right, so that declaration is done by the chairperson of the commission.
Okay. So as we prepare to wrap up, would you wish to, what assurance do you offer the Guyanese people, voters heading to the poll? But maybe persons also would want to know how the seats are tabulated. I mean, I know it's a lengthy process, but briefly.
Right. So as you know, our electoral system operates on a proportional representation. Yes. And so there's a hair quota formula that is used. Essentially, it's the total number of valid votes cast. You use a system there to determine divided by the number of seats in the National Assembly. And based on that quota, that is how you determine how many votes for a seat in the National Assembly. As you said, it's quite a lengthy process. But so the CEO in his report will then have to do all those kind of nitty-gritties and all of that. So I will not spend time to go through that process here. So once we have that process completed, Svetlana, and the declaration is made, that essentially brings us to an end externally, as I'm saying externally, of that process. But for GCOM, our work still continues. We have other reports and other things that we have to do behind the scenes. Of course, issuing the certificate of election, because then political parties will now have to extract names from their list of candidates who will take up those respective seats, whether at the national level or at the regional level. So there are other things that are done after that period. But as you said, as we wrap up, going into tomorrow's election, Svetlana, I believe that GCOM has done the work. We continue throughout the period to engage with stakeholders. We're talking here a political environment, and therefore stakeholders have raised dissatisfaction along the line. We've continued to reiterate our position in terms of sticking within the legal parameters of what we can do. And so with that in mind, with the strength and the effort that we've put in place in terms of the training of our staff, putting the technical competencies to test in relation to the software that will be used for the tabulation process and all of that, it is safe for me to say that we are at a comfortable place for the delivery of these elections tomorrow. As I've mentioned very earlier, I see efficiency happening at the conduct, and it's a test that we've had on discipline services balloting day. And so notwithstanding the emergence of the photos and stuff that surfaced online, generally it was a smooth process. I do not anticipate anything else happening or anything different happening tomorrow as the electorate heads to the poll. Our mantra is to ensure that we deliver elections that are credible, that are done in a transparent way, and at the end of the process we can say that we are satisfied with the manner in which the polls have been conducted.
One other question though, how soon after? I know that's on everybody's mind. How soon after?
You know, it is always the question, and I understand the anxiety. I'm saying this all the time from the legal perspective, but the law actually gives us 15 days for a declaration. Right. But all things being equal, we are looking no later than the night of the 2nd or early on the 3rd. All things being equal, again, as I mentioned before, in relation to requests for recount, we have to give stakeholders the opportunity if they so desire. But from our end, barring any kind of such hiccup or so on, it is important for us to, as quickly as possible, make those declarations available. Of course, the electorate, if participated in the process, I'm eager to know what is happening, and we want to ensure that those anxieties are alleviated as quickly as possible.
Thank you so much for being here on Sources with me to share very important information on Guyana's electoral system and the process that would unfold tomorrow. I know there will be a lot of first-time voters, and it's something new for them, and they want to know what to expect when they get to the poll. And I thank you very much for explaining and walking us through that very important process up to the declaration of the elections. Thank you so much, Yolanda.
Thank you so much. It's always a privilege to be here.
Thank you. Now, to your viewers, those who are eligible to vote, we at New Source would like to encourage you to go out there and vote. It's your democratic right. It's a constitutional right, and we encourage eligible Guyanese and persons who reach the requirement to go out there and vote. The New Source team will be covering the elections from the time the poll opens to the declaration and even the swearing of the president. So stay locked into our New Source page, Gordon Mosley's page, of course, as we bring you live coverage tomorrow. And with that, we've come to the end of this edition of Sources. I've been your host, Svetlana Marshall.